Before he ruled the largest land empire the world had ever seen, before cities burned and kings knelt, there was a boy no one feared, a child born into cold grasslands where survival was never promised, a boy whose name meant iron, yet whose life would be forged by betrayal. This is not the story of a conqueror, not yet. This is the story of how the world's most unstoppable force began as a hunted child. The winds of the Mongolian steppe do not forgive weakness. They cut through skin, through bone, through hope. Somewhere near a sacred mountain, beside the winding Wonon River, a child was born into this brutal world. His name was Temujin. History would later rename him Genghis Khan, but at birth he was just another fragile life surrounded by danger. The steppe was ruled not by borders, but by blood. Tribes rose and fell through loyalty and vengeance. Alliances were temporary, trust was lethal. Temujin was born into the Borjigan clan, a name that carried pride, but also enemies. His father, Yasuge, was a chieftain, feared by some, hated by many. A man who lived by the sword and made enemies with every victory. Yasuge had stolen a bride. Her name was Holun. She was taken from another tribe, ripped from her future, and forced into a life that would never stop running. That single act sparked a blood feud that would echo for generations. Temujin would inherit that hatred before he could even walk. As a child, Temujin learned to ride before he could fully stand. He learned to draw a bow before he understood mercy. Every game was a lesson in survival. Every hunt was practice for war. But childhood on the steppe was short, and safety was an illusion. When Temujin was still young, his father rode out to arrange a marriage for him. Yasuge never returned, poisoned by enemies who smiled while they poured the drink. Just like that, the family's protection vanished. The tribe did not mourn. They abandoned them. Hulun and her children were cast out, stripped of status, animals and allies, left to starve on the open plains. The boy who would one day command millions now scavenged for roots and rodents. Winter did not care about destiny. Hunger did not recognize greatness. Temujin learned his first real lesson. Then, no one was coming to save him. Survival twisted the family from within. Brothers turned against each other. Jealousy grew sharper than any blade. One day, a single argument over food changed everything. Temujin killed his own half-brother, not in rage, not in passion, but in cold resolve. That moment shattered what remained of his childhood. It also revealed something terrifying. Temujin would do whatever was necessary to live. The steppe noticed. Rival tribes watched the abandoned boy with interest. Some saw weakness, others saw potential. Soon, Temujin was captured, enslaved, and paraded like an animal, a wooden collar locked around his neck. Every step a humiliation, every night a reminder that freedom was gone. But iron does not break easily. Temujin escaped, under darkness, through freezing rivers, past guards who underestimated a starving boy. When he vanished into the night, the steppe whispered his name. He found allies in unlikely places, a childhood friend, a sworn brother, a powerful tribal leader who remembered his father. Piece by piece, Temujin began rebuilding what was stolen from him. But the world he returned to was even more violent. Old feuds were waiting. The tribe that stole his mother, the clan that enslaved him, the enemies who poisoned his father. This was no longer about survival. This was about vengeance. Temujin was still young, still underestimated, still poor. But something had changed inside him. He was no longer chasing safety. He was chasing control. And control on the steppe could only be won one way, through blood. power on the steppe was never inherited. It was taken. Temujin understood this before most men twice his age. Survival had already taught him the cost of weakness, and freedom had shown him something even more dangerous: opportunity. As he returned to the open plains, word spread quietly. The abandoned boy had escaped captivity. The outcast had teeth. Some laughed, others watched more carefully. Temujin did not announce himself as a leader. He moved like a shadow, gathering people who had been discarded just like him. Runaway slaves, broken warriors, families betrayed by their own tribes. Men with nothing to lose were loyal in a way blood relatives never were. He fed them, he protected them, and most importantly, he rewarded loyalty over lineage. On the steppe, this was revolutionary and dangerous. His first true test came when the Merkits struck. The same tribe tied to his mother's abduction years earlier returned to finish old business. They attacked at night, they burned tents, and they stole Temujin's young wife, Berta. In that moment, history balanced on a knife's edge. Many men would have accepted the loss. The steppe often demanded it. Temujin refused. He rode to Togrul, the powerful leader of the Kerik tribe and former blood brother of his father. Temujin did not beg. He reminded Togrul of old oaths, of shared battles, of debts unpaid. Then he turned to his childhood friend Jamuka, a man born to power, respected by nobles, everything Temujin was not. Together, they formed an alliance that shook the grasslands. The rescue was swift and merciless. The Merkits were crushed. Berta was reclaimed, but victory left behind a new tension. Jamuka believed leadership belonged to noble blood. Temujin believed leadership belonged to those who earned it. They had fought side by side, but they were no longer walking the same path. Followers began choosing sides. Jamuka had tradition. Temujin had momentum. Men defected quietly at first, then openly. They preferred Temujin's rule. Clear rewards, harsh punishments, no favoritism. Loyalty was everything. Birth meant nothing. This terrified the old elite. The steppe had rules. Temujin was breaking them all. War became inevitable. Jamuka struck first, declaring himself the rightful aristocratic leader of the Mongols. His forces were larger, better armed, backed by ancient clans. Temujin's army was smaller, poorer, but disciplined. When the two sides met, the grasslands drank blood. Jamuka won the battle, and then he made a mistake that would haunt history. He executed prisoners brutally, believing fear would secure loyalty. Fear spreads fast, but loyalty spreads farther. Temujin retreated, but he did not collapse. He studied his defeat. He reorganized. He promoted men based on skill. He punished betrayal without mercy. Slowly, his army transformed into something the steppe had never seen. A force united not by tribe, but by purpose. Then Jamuka's allies began to abandon him. One by one, tribes turned toward Temujin. Some willingly, some under threat, some after being crushed. Temujin offered a simple choice: submit and be protected, resist and be erased. There was no middle ground. Cities were not spared, but those who surrendered were absorbed. Their warriors became Mongols. Their leaders were replaced. This was conquest through integration, and it worked. Battles came faster now. Each victory fed the next. Temujin adapted tactics from enemies, used deception, feigned retreats, ambushes, psychological warfare. He turned the vast steppe into a weapon. His enemies never knew where he would strike, only that he would. Jamuka fled. Years later, he was betrayed by his own followers and delivered to Temujin in chains. Tradition demanded execution. Brotherhood demanded mercy. Temujin offered him a chance to rule together. Jamaka refused. He asked for an honorable death, and Temujin granted it. Not out of weakness, but finality. With Jamaka gone, resistance collapsed. In 1206, the tribes gathered. For the first time in history, the Mongols stood united. Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, not by bloodline, not by birth, but by conquest, loyalty, and fear. The boy who once starved now commanded an entire people, but unity was only the beginning. Beyond the steppe lay wealthy kingdoms, walled cities, empires that had never heard his name. They believed distance would protect them. They believed walls meant safety. They were wrong, because Genghis Khan was no longer fighting to survive. He was about to teach the world what survival truly meant. The world beyond the steppe did not yet understand what had been born in 1206. To the south and west lay civilizations, ancient, wealthy, and confident. Empires with stone cities, written laws, and armies that believed nomads were little more than raiders. From their palaces, the Mongols looked insignificant. A passing storm at best. None of them realized that storms grow strongest when ignored. Genghis Khan understood something his enemies did not. The steppe could unite men, but conquest required discipline. He reshaped Mongol society from the inside out. Old tribal loyalties were shattered and replaced with a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Brothers were separated. Friends reassigned. Loyalty flowed upward to the Khan alone. Disobedience meant death. Obedience meant reward beyond imagination. He wrote laws where none had existed. The yasa was harsh and absolute. Theft, betrayal, desertion, even disobedience in battle were punished without mercy. But the law protected those who followed it. Women could manage camps. Religious freedom was enforced. Messengers were sacred. This was not chaos. It was controlled brutality, and it forged an army that moved like a single body. Then came the scouts. Genghis sent riders far ahead, mapping routes, counting soldiers, studying weaknesses. They did not attack. They watched. They listened. They learned. By the time Mongol armies appeared on the horizon, the battle had already been decided. Enemies just did not know it yet. The first great target was the Sha kingdom, rich, fortified, confident behind its walls. When Mongol horsemen appeared, the Sha rulers laughed. Nomads could not take cities. Everyone knew that Genghis Khan made an example of them. He starved cities, cut supply lines, redirected rivers. When walls fell, mercy vanished. The message was deliberate. Submit early and live. Resist and be erased from memory. The message traveled faster than his army. Next came the Jin dynasty of northern China, one of the most powerful states in Asia. Massive armies, strong fortresses, advanced technology. They underestimated speed. They underestimated adaptability. Mongols learned siege warfare by forcing captured engineers to teach them. They adopted new weapons within weeks. Catapults, gunpowder bomb. Nothing was rejected if it worked. Cities fell one after another. Refugees spread terror ahead of the Mongol advance. Stories of slaughter were exaggerated. Genghis encouraged it. Fear was cheaper than war. Some cities surrendered at the sight of Mongol banners. Others resisted. Those cities became warnings. But conquest was not just about destruction. Genghis Khan absorbed talent wherever he found it. Administrators, engineers, scholars, doctors. Those who served were protected. Those who resisted were annihilated. This balance made his empire expand faster than any before it. Then came the event that changed everything. To the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire. Vast, wealthy, powerful. Genghis Khan did not initially seek war. He sent traders, envoys, gifts, a proposal for peaceful relations. The Khwarezmian Shah responded by executing the traders and humiliating the envoys. One was shaved, another was killed. The message was clear. Genghis Khan removed his helmet. He faced the sky, and he swore revenge. What followed was not a war. It was an extermination. Mongol armies split into multiple columns, moving thousands of miles apart, striking simultaneously. Cities that had never seen war woke to fire. Samarkand fell. Bukhara fell. Urganch resisted and paid the ultimate price. Entire populations were wiped out. Not out of madness, out of calculation. Resistance had to become unthinkable. The Shah fled. He ran until the world ran out. He died alone on an island, hunted by ghosts. By the time the campaign ended, the Khwarezmian Empire no longer existed. The world finally understood. Walls did not stop the Mongols. Distance did not slow them. Armies did not defeat them. And Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a force of nature. Yet even as his empire expanded beyond imagination, cracks began to form. His sons competed for favor. Succession loomed like a storm cloud. Genghis Khan ruled through strength, but strength does not live forever, and he knew it. He began preparing the next generation, teaching them conquest, teaching them cruelty, teaching them control, because the empire could not die with him. Not yet. But fate had its own plans. On the edge of his greatest victories, as the Mongol banners stretched from China to the Caspian Sea, Genghis Khan rode toward one final campaign, against the Shah once more, against enemies who had not learned their lesson. This time, the threat would not come from an enemy blade. It would come from within his own body. Power did not protect Genghis Khan from time. As his armies thundered across continents, his body began to betray him. The man who had never known defeat now felt pain he could not ride away from. Still, he refused to stop. Weakness was not allowed. Not in his empire, not in himself. When the Shah kingdom rebelled once more, Genghis Khan saw it not as a threat, but as an insult that demanded erasure. The campaign was ruthless, even by Mongol standards. Cities were surrounded and strangled. Fields burned. Water sources poisoned. The Shah begged for mercy too late. Genghis Khan wanted the world to understand a single truth. Rebellion was unforgivable, even for the dying. But somewhere during this campaign, something went wrong. Sources disagree. Some say he fell from his horse. Others whisper of an illness. A few darker legends suggest a wound that never healed. The truth vanished with him. What remained was fear. The Khan was dying, and if the great Khan fell, the world itself might fracture. He kept his condition secret. Orders still flowed. Punishments were enforced. Victories continued. His generals obeyed without question. But behind closed tents, decisions turned toward the future. Genghis Khan knew the empire could not survive chaos at the top. Succession had destroyed countless kingdoms. He would not allow it to destroy his. His sons were powerful and dangerous. Joshi, the eldest, was distant and mistrusted. Questions about his birth had always haunted him. Chagatai was fierce, proud, and uncontrollable. Tolui was loyal but young, and Ogedei, not the strongest, not the fiercest, but the most balanced, calm, calculating, reliable. Genghis Khan made his choice. Ogedei would succeed him. The decision angered some, terrified others, but none dared challenge it. Not while the Khan still breathed. In 1227, Genghis Khan died. There was no public announcement, no mourning, no pause in conquest. His death was kept secret as his body was carried back across the steppe. Anyone who encountered the funeral procession was killed. The location of his grave was erased. Even today, no one knows where the greatest conqueror in history lies. The man vanished. The empire did not. Ogedei took the throne, and the Mongol machine accelerated. Under his rule, conquest became administration. Roads were built, trade routes protected. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol control. Merchants traveled farther than ever before. Ideas crossed borders, technology spread. The world began shrinking under Mongol rule. Then came the next wave. To the west, Mongol armies stormed into Eastern Europe. Russian principalities burned. Kiev fell. Hungarian armies were shattered. Poland collapsed in terror. European kings prepared for annihilation. They prayed, they fortified, they waited for the end. It never came. Ogedei died suddenly in 1241, and Mongol tradition demanded a pause. The armies withdrew to choose a new great Khan. Europe was spared not by strength, but by timing. In the east, the Mongols turned toward China once more. Generation by generation, they pushed south, siege by siege, city by city, until finally, under Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, the Song dynasty collapsed. China fell completely under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty was born, from Korea to the Middle East, from Siberia to the gates of Vienna. The Mongol Empire became the largest continuous land empire in human history. No empire before it, none since. But conquest had a cost. The empire was too vast, too diverse, too powerful to remain unified forever. Civil wars erupted. Brothers fought. Brothers. Khanates broke away. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Yuan dynasty. Genghis Khan's creation fractured, but it did not disappear. His legacy reshaped the world. Borders changed. Trade exploded. Warfare evolved. Empires learned fear. Some remember him as a monster, others as a visionary. To this day, millions carry his blood in their veins. His DNA spread almost as far as his armies. The boy abandoned on the steppe became a ruler who bent continents. He did not just conquer land, he conquered history, and yet the most terrifying truth remains. The Mongol Empire was not an accident. It was a system, a method, a warning. Because Genghis Khan proved something the world still struggles to accept, that civilization is fragile, that order can collapse in a single generation, and that sometimes history is not shaped by kings or gods, but by a hungry child who refused to die. The empire Genghis Khan created did not slow down after his death. It adapted, like a predator, learning new terrain. It changed shape without losing its hunger. Under Ogedei, conquest became organized on a scale never seen before. This was no longer a loose confederation of riders. It was a global engine of domination, fueled by discipline, intelligence, and terror, carefully deployed. Ogedei understood something crucial. Fear alone could win battles, but order was needed to rule. He expanded the Yam system, a vast network of relay stations stretching across Asia. Messengers rode day and night, changing horses, carrying commands faster than any empire in history. An order issued in Mongolia could reach the edge of Europe in weeks. The world had never moved this fast. Cities that once lay on the fringes of civilization were now connected. Trade surged. Silk, spices, gold, ideas and diseases moved freely under Mongol protection. Merchants were taxed, but protected. Caravans crossed deserts safely. Even enemies admitted it. Under Mongol rule, the roads were safer than ever before. Violence and stability existed side by side. But while trade flourished, war never stopped. To the west, generals like Sabbatai perfected Mongol warfare into an art. He was not born noble, he was not physically imposing, but his mind was lethal. Sabbatai planned campaigns years in advance, coordinating armies separated by thousands of miles. He struck enemies who believed themselves safe, luring them into traps they could not escape. Russian princes underestimated him. They argued among themselves, refusing unity. Mongol forces annihilated them one by one. The Battle of the Kalka River was not just a defeat. It was a demonstration. Mongols pretended to retreat for days, drawing enemies deeper and deeper, then turned and destroyed them completely. European warfare would never be the same again. Fear reached the heart of Europe. Chroniclers describe demons on horseback. Priests spoke of divine punishment. Cities prepared for siege. They could not survive. When Hungary fell, the continent froze. The end felt inevitable. And then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. Not because they were defeated, but because tradition demanded obedience to succession. The empire paused, but it did not forget. Back in Asia, internal tensions grew. Power was now inherited, not earned. The unity forged by Genghis Khan's personality began to crack. Great Khans ruled from distant capitals. Regional leaders gained autonomy. Ambition replaced obedience. The Mongol Empire was splitting into distinct worlds. Yet even divided, it remained dominant. In Persia, Hulagu Khan destroyed Baghdad in 1258. The city, once the heart of Islamic civilization, was obliterated. Libraries burned. Scholars killed. The Abbasid Caliphate ended in a single catastrophic moment. The shockwaves reached every corner of the Muslim world. Mongol brutality had not softened with time. It had evolved. In China, Kublai Khan faced a different challenge. He ruled not just through fear, but governance. He embraced Chinese administration, adopted titles, and ruled from Beijing. Many Mongols saw this as weakness, but Kublai understood scale. To control millions, you needed legitimacy. The Yuan dynasty became one of the most powerful regimes in Chinese history. But Mongols ruling settled civilizations faced a problem their ancestors never had: comfort. Warriors became administrators. Nomads settled into cities. Discipline faded. Identity blurred. The empire that once thrived on movement began to slow. And history punishes those who stop adapting. Rebellions erupted. In China, in Persia, in Central Asia. Local populations resented foreign rule. The Mongols responded with force. But each suppression cost more than the last. Armies grew expensive. Loyalty weakened. The machine that once fed itself now consumed its own strength. Still, the legacy endured. Gunpowder spread westward through Mongol routes. Paper money expanded. Diplomatic exchange increased. Marco Polo traveled under Mongol protection, carrying stories that reshaped Europe's understanding of the world. The Mongol Empire connected civilizations that had barely known each other existed, but unity was gone. By the late 14th century, the empire existed only in fragments. The Golden Horde declined. The Ilkhanate collapsed. The Yuan dynasty fell to rebellion. What remained were echoes of something terrifying and magnificent. Yet, Genghis Khan's shadow never faded. His descendants continued to rule and conquer. His laws influenced future empires. His military tactics are still studied today, and his impact on world history remains unmatched. No single individual has ever reshaped so much of the world, so fast, with such lasting consequences. The boy who was abandoned changed how war was fought, how empires rose, how continents connected. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the Mongol Empire was not inevitable. It was built by choices, by discipline, by fear, by loyalty earned, not inherited. And that means it could happen again. Because somewhere, in some forgotten place, another hungry child may be learning the same lessons. Temujin learned on the steppe, and history is always waiting. The Mongol Empire did not disappear when its banners fell. It transformed the world in ways that are still unfolding centuries later. Long after the thunder of hooves faded, the systems Genghis Khan set in motion continued to shape history. This was no ordinary empire that rose, ruled, and vanished. It rewired how civilizations interacted, traded, fought, and even thought. One of the greatest paradoxes of Mongol rule was that the same empire known for unimaginable destruction also created unprecedented connectivity. Under Mongol control, the Silk Road became the safest trade network the world had ever seen. Merchants traveled from Venice to Beijing under a single imperial umbrella. Goods moved freely, but so did ideas, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, and philosophy crossed borders that had once been sealed by fear and distance. This era became known as the Pax Mongolica, a brutal peace enforced by the threat of annihilation. Bandits were hunted down mercilessly. Corruption was punished harshly. Local rulers were allowed to govern as long as taxes were paid, and rebellion never surfaced. For many traders and travelers, Mongol rule was terrifying in reputation, but practical in reality. Order existed because chaos was not tolerated. Religion was another, unexpected space of tolerance. Genghis Khan had understood early that belief could unite or destroy, so he chose control over conversion. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans all lived under Mongol protection. Priests were exempt from taxes. Debates were encouraged. Faith was allowed as long as loyalty to the Khan came first. In an age of religious wars, this policy was revolutionary, but beneath the surface, the empire was rotting. The descendants of Genghis Khan no longer lived the harsh life of the steppe. They were born into silk, gold, and marble palaces. The discipline that once defined the Mongol warrior weakened with every generation. Loyalty shifted from the idea of empire to personal ambition. Khanates fought each other. Alliances shattered. The unity that had terrified the world was gone. Then came disease. The same trade routes that connected continents also carried death. The Black Death traveled along Mongol-controlled roads, moving from Asia into Europe. Entire cities collapsed. Populations were wiped out. While the Mongols did not create the plague, their empire accelerated its spread. The world they connected paid a terrible price for that connection. As Europe struggled to recover, it changed. Feudal systems weakened. Labor became valuable. New ideas took root. In a strange twist of fate, the devastation carried along Mongol roots helped set the stage for the Renaissance. The empire that burned cities also helped ignite a rebirth of knowledge. In China, Resentment against foreign rule grew unbearable. The Yuan dynasty collapsed under rebellion. The Ming replaced it, determined to erase Mongol influence. They closed borders, rebuilt walls. Isolation replaced openness. In Persia and Central Asia, Mongol successor states faded into history, absorbed by new powers who inherited their territories but not their unity. Yet the memory of Genghis Khan never disappeared. To some, he remained a butcher. To others, a lawgiver. In Mongolia, he became a symbol of national identity. In military academies, his strategies are still studied. Feigned retreats, psychological warfare, speed and coordination. Modern generals still recognize his brilliance. Even genetics tells his story. Scientists discovered that a significant percentage of men across Asia carry genetic markers tracing back to a single male ancestor from Genghis Khan's era. His bloodline spread almost as far as his empire. Few humans in history have left such a literal mark on the world. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is not blood or conquest. It is the lesson he proved beyond doubt, that history is not shaped only by wealth or tradition or divine right. It can be shaped by hunger, by adaptability, by the refusal to accept weakness as destiny. Genghis Khan did not inherit an empire. He assembled one from the broken pieces of his life, from betrayal, from exile, from survival at any cost. And that is why his story endures, because it forces an uncomfortable question. If one abandoned child could rise from nothing and reorder the world, what else in history was never inevitable? What empires stand today only because no one has yet challenged them the way Temujin challenged his fate? The Mongol Empire was not just a chapter in history, it was a warning written in fire and blood. A reminder that civilization rests on fragile ground, and that sometimes the greatest forces in history begin far from palaces and crowns. They begin in the cold, on open grasslands, with a child who learns too early that the world shows no mercy, and decides to show none in return. By the time the Mongol Empire fractured into rival khanates, many believed the age of the horse archers was finally ending. New powers rose, old cities rebuilt. Survivors convinced themselves the nightmare had passed. But history does not erase influence so easily. Even broken, the Mongol world continued shaping the future in quiet, unsettling ways. Across the Eurasian landmass, rulers began copying Mongol methods, census systems, courier networks, military organization based on merit instead of birth. Even enemies learned from the conquerors who had destroyed them. The Mongols had proven that speed could defeat size, that intelligence could defeat walls, and that fear, carefully managed, could defeat armies before battle even began. In Russia, the shadow was especially long. For generations, Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde extracted tribute from Russian principalities. They did not rule directly, they controlled through pressure, taxation, and selective punishment. Moscow learned this system well. When Mongol power weakened, Russian princes adopted those same methods to build their own centralized state. In many ways, the rise of Russia followed a Mongol blueprint. In the Islamic world, memories were darker. Baghdad's destruction was not just physical, it shattered confidence. Scholars mourned the loss of centuries of knowledge. The idea that civilization could be wiped away in days haunted the region for generations. Even so, Mongol rulers who converted to Islam later became patrons of culture and science, blending conquest with continuity. Destruction and creation once again walked side by side. In China, Mongol rule left scars and lessons. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan was obsessed with control and defense. Borders closed, The Great Wall was rebuilt stronger than ever. Trade was restricted. Where the Mongols had connected the world, the Ming tried to seal it out. Fear of another invasion shaped Chinese policy for centuries, and still the legend of Genghis Khan grew. Stories changed with distance. In Europe, he became a demon king, a symbol of apocalypse. In Persia, a destroyer sent by fate. In Mongolia, a unifier, a father of the nation. Each culture remembered the part of him that hurt them most, or saved them, or explained their suffering. But behind every version of the legend stood the same truth. Genghis Khan was not supernatural. He was not chosen by gods. He was human, and that made his achievements more terrifying, not less. He understood people better than weapons. He knew that men fight harder for reward than for bloodlines, that loyalty grows when it is paid, not demanded. That fear spreads faster than armies. That mercy, used strategically, can be more powerful than slaughter. These were not accidental discoveries. They were learned through pain, through hunger, through betrayal, and that is why his empire expanded so fast. Most empires rely on bureaucracy first, force second. Genghis Khan reversed the formula. He used force to create order, then used order to expand force. Every conquered region fed the next conquest. Every victory made the next one easier. It was a self-sustaining system of expansion. But no system built on conquest can last forever. Once expansion slowed, the Mongol model weakened. Without new lands, rewards shrank. Without rewards, loyalty fractured. Without loyalty, violence turned inward. The empire that had thrived on motion began collapsing under its own weight. And yet, even in collapse, the Mongols changed warfare forever. Before them, wars were seasonal, slow, predictable. After them, speed became essential. Intelligence networks became critical. Psychological warfare became standard. Feigned retreats, coordinated multi-front attacks, and total war strategies entered the global military vocabulary. Modern warfare owes more to the Mongols than most people realize. Even the idea of global history itself was shaped by them. Before the Mongols, civilizations often developed in isolation. After them, isolation became impossible. Trade routes linked continents. Knowledge crossed borders. Diseases spread. Cultures collided. The world became interconnected in ways it had never been before. This was the beginning of a truly global age. And at the center of it all stood a man who never built a palace, never founded a city, and never ruled from a throne of stone. Genghis Khan ruled from horseback, from tents, from movement itself. His empire had no capital in the traditional sense, because it did not need one. Control moved wherever he moved. That mobility was his greatest weapon. When future empires tried to imitate him, they struggled. Sedentary states could copy Mongol tactics, but not Mongol identity. Once the conquerors settled, they became vulnerable to the same weaknesses they once exploited. Comfort replaced hardship. Luxury replaced discipline. The edge dulled. And so, the Mongol moment passed, but the question it raised never went away. If civilization could be torn apart so completely by an outsider, if the greatest cities on earth could fall in weeks, if emperors and caliphs could be reduced to refugees, then how strong was the world really? Genghis Khan forced humanity to confront that question, and it still has no comfortable answer, because his story is not just about the past. It is about potential. About how quickly order can collapse, about how power can rise from the margins. History prefers to believe that progress is inevitable, that civilization only moves forward. Genghis Khan proved otherwise. He showed that history can turn suddenly, violently, irreversibly, and that sometimes the most important moments in human history do not begin in capitals or courts. They begin with a single decision by a single person who refuses to accept the limits the world has placed on them. Long after the last Mongol banners faded from the horizon, the world continued to live inside the consequences of what they had unleashed. The age that followed was not simply a recovery from devastation, it was a reordering. Empires that rose afterward did so in a world the Mongols had already reshaped. Borders were redrawn, not just on maps, but in the human imagination. What once seemed impossible now felt achievable, and what once felt eternal now seemed fragile. Europe changed first. The shock of near destruction forced kings and generals to rethink everything. Castles alone were no longer enough. Heavy knights charging blindly into battle were no longer unbeatable. Mobility, intelligence, and coordination mattered more than armor and titles. Standing armies slowly replaced feudal levies. Centralized authority grew stronger. Ironically, the fear of Mongol invasion helped accelerate the rise of stronger European states. Trade routes expanded westward. Europeans, now aware of the vast wealth of Asia, searched desperately for new paths east. The Mongols had shown that the world was connected. When their empire collapsed, Europeans tried to recreate that connection themselves. This hunger for access would eventually push ships into unknown oceans. In that sense, the Mongol Empire helped ignite the age of exploration. In the Islamic world, recovery was slower and more painful. The destruction of major cultural centers left wounds that lasted centuries. Yet, even here, Mongol influence persisted. Successor states blended Mongol military traditions with Islamic governance. New dynasties emerged stronger, more centralized, and more cautious. Power became concentrated, control tightened, survival demanded it. China took a different lesson. After expelling the Mongols, the Ming rulers became obsessed with stability. They feared chaos above all else. Innovation slowed. Foreign contact was restricted. The Great Wall was reinforced, not just as a physical barrier, but as a psychological one. Where the Mongols had forced openness, the Ming enforced isolation. It brought peace, but at a cost. China turned inward while the rest of the world slowly expanded outward. And Mongolia itself, the homeland of the greatest empire in history, returned to the steppe. The cities vanished, the palaces crumbled, nomadic life resumed, but memory remained. Genghis Khan became more than a man. He became an idea, a symbol of unity, of strength, of identity. In a land without monuments, stories became the empire's stone. Yet history did not stop testing the world. Centuries later, conquerors like Timur would attempt to revive the Mongol model. He used terror, speed, ruthless efficiency, and for a moment it worked. But the world had changed. Gunpowder weapons reshaped warfare. Cannons broke walls that once stood for centuries. Empires now required industry, bureaucracy, and constant innovation. The age of pure horse archer dominance was over. Still, the Mongols were never forgotten. Military theorists continued to study them. Modern strategists analyze Mongol campaigns for lessons in logistics, morale, and command structure. Business leaders reference their merit-based systems. Historians debate whether they were destroyers or creators. The argument never ends, because the answer is uncomfortable. They were both. Genghis Khan was not evil in the way myths portray him, nor heroic in the way legends celebrate him. He was something far more disturbing. He was effective. He saw the world as it was, not as it wished to be, and he built his empire accordingly. That realism is what still unsettles us. because it suggests that morality does not decide history. Power does. Organization does. Adaptability does. Genghis Khan did not conquer because he was cruel. He conquered because he was prepared to do what others would not, to break traditions, to abandon sentiment, to treat war as a system rather than a spectacle. And systems outlast individuals. Even today, the modern world reflects Mongol fingerprints. Globalization, rapid communication, integrated economies, cultural exchange mixed with cultural destruction. These are not new ideas. They are echoes. The Mongols forced humanity into its first truly global era. Everything that followed built on that foundation. But there is another legacy that is harder to face. The Mongols proved that civilization is not a shield. Education does not guarantee safety. Wealth invites attention. Walls invite challenge. Every society believes itself advanced until it meets a force that does not play by its rules. Genghis Khan shattered the illusion that progress equals protection. That lesson remains relevant. History often celebrates builders, kings who create cities, lawgivers who write codes, innovators who advance technology. Genghis Khan did none of these in the traditional sense. Yet his impact rivals any of them. Perhaps because destruction clears space for transformation, and transformation is the true engine of history. This is why his story refuses to fade. It is not comfortable. It is not inspiring in the usual way. But it is honest. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by outsiders as by institutions, that the margins are dangerous, that hunger, when combined with intelligence and opportunity, can overturn entire worlds. Genghis Khan did not ask permission to change history. He did not wait for acceptance. He did not seek legitimacy. He took it. And that is the most unsettling part of all. Because if history can be rewritten by a single determined force once, it can happen again. Empires rise believing they are permanent. They fall believing the world has betrayed them. But the truth is simpler. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is guaranteed. And power always flows to those who understand the moment they live in better than anyone else. Genghis Khan understood his moment perfectly. The world paid the price and inherited the future. The story of the Mongols does not truly end with empires falling or borders stabilizing. It continues in how humanity remembers power, fear, and transformation. Long after the Mongol Khanates faded, their psychological footprint remained carved into collective memory. Entire civilizations adjusted their behavior based on what the Mongols had proven possible. One of the most profound changes was how rulers thought about intelligence. Before the Mongols, many wars were fought blindly. Armies marched, met, and clashed with limited knowledge of what waited ahead. Genghis Khan changed that forever. Espionage became essential. Scouts were no longer optional. Information became a weapon as valuable as soldiers. Later empires learned this lesson well. The Ottomans, the Safavids, the Russians, even modern intelligence agencies unknowingly trace their logic back to the steppe. Fear itself became strategic. The Mongols understood that terror could travel faster than armies. They allowed stories of massacres to spread. They exaggerated numbers. They encouraged rumor. By the time their forces arrived, many cities were already defeated in the minds of their defenders. Surrender saved lives. Resistance erased them. This psychological formula would be repeated throughout history by conquerors who realized that breaking morale was cheaper than breaking walls. Yet fear was never random. That was the mistake many later tyrants made. Mongol brutality followed rules. Submit early and survive. resist and disappear. This predictability made their terror effective. It created choice, even if that choice was horrifying. Chaos terrifies less than certainty. Genghis Khan understood that deeply. Another lasting impact was meritocracy. In a world obsessed with noble bloodlines, the Mongols promoted based on ability. A shepherd could command thousands. A blacksmith could become a general. Loyalty and skill mattered more than ancestry. This shattered traditional hierarchies wherever the Mongols ruled. Old elites despised it. Common people embraced it. Future empires quietly adopted similar systems, even if they never admitted the source. But merit has a dark side. When power is earned through violence and success, it demands constant proof. The Mongol system rewarded conquest. When conquest slowed, ambition turned inward. Generals challenged each other. Princes plotted. Violence that once faced outward began consuming the empire itself. This cycle would repeat in countless regimes throughout history. Revolution rewards strength. Stability requires restraint. Few systems master both. As centuries passed, the Mongols became symbols rather than rulers. Writers turned them into monsters or heroes, depending on who was telling the story. Myths replaced nuance. Genghis Khan became larger than life, stripped of context, frozen in extremes, but history is rarely extreme. It is complicated, and the Mongols were no exception. They destroyed cities. They also protected trade. They killed millions. They also connected continents. They erased cultures. They also spread knowledge. Holding these truths together is uncomfortable, but necessary, because the Mongol story forces a deeper reflection. Progress is not linear. Civilization does not only move forward through peace and enlightenment. Sometimes it advances through collapse, through shock, through trauma that forces adaptation. The Mongols were one of history's greatest shocks, and shocks change everything. The world after the Mongols was more connected, more cautious, and more aware of its vulnerability. Empires built larger armies, stronger walls, faster communication systems. They centralized power to avoid fragmentation. Many of the institutions we associate with the modern state were accelerated by the fear of another Mongol-style catastrophe. Even borders hardened. Before the Mongols, frontiers were fluid. After them, states became obsessed with defining and defending territory. Control replaced flexibility. Movement was regulated. Passports, checkpoints, and bureaucratic systems all trace their philosophical roots to a world that learned the cost of unchecked mobility. Ironically, the Mongols themselves had thrived on that mobility. They proved that freedom of movement could be the ultimate weapon. But once the world learned that lesson, it did everything possible to contain it. The modern world is, in many ways, a reaction to the Mongol age. And still, fascination remains. Films, books, games, documentaries. Genghis Khan continues to dominate imagination, not because people admire violence, but because they are drawn to clarity. His story is brutal, but it is clear: cause and effect, choice and consequence, survival and domination. In a chaotic world, such clarity feels strangely compelling, yet clarity comes at a price. The Mongol Empire reminds us that efficiency does not equal justice. That order can be enforced through terror. That peace can exist under threat of annihilation. These truths are unsettling because they contradict comforting narratives about human progress. They suggest that humanity has not changed as much as it likes to believe. Technology evolves, weapons advance, languages shift, but power still obeys the same rules. Those who adapt fastest dominate. Those who cling to tradition fall behind. Those who underestimate outsiders pay the highest price. Genghis Khan did not invent these rules. He exposed them, and that is why his legacy feels timeless. Even today, nations fear disruption more than invasion. Economic collapse, cyber warfare, rapid ideological movements. These are modern echoes of the same fear medieval cities felt when Mongol riders appeared on the horizon. Different tools, same anxiety. The Mongols remind us that threats rarely come from where we expect them. They come from edges, from margins, from places we dismiss as backward or insignificant. Temujin came from a world most civilizations barely acknowledged, and he forced them to acknowledge him in the most brutal way imaginable. That lesson lingers, because somewhere beyond the centers of power, beyond the capitals and institutions, forces are always forming, studying, learning, adapting, waiting for opportunity. History does not announce these moments in advance. It reveals them only after the world has already changed. Genghis Khan understood this truth instinctively. He did not ask whether the world was ready. He tested it, and when it failed, he reshaped it. The Mongol Empire may be gone, but its message remains carved into history itself. Power favors preparation. Change favors speed, and the future belongs to those who recognize the moment before everyone else does. As centuries passed, the Mongol Empire slipped from living memory into legend, but legends have a way of shaping reality long after facts fade. What survived was not just the story of conquest, but a deeper influence on how humanity understands power itself. The Mongols became a reference point, a warning whispered whenever societies grew too confident, too comfortable, too sure of their permanence. Historians began to notice a pattern. Before the Mongols, most great powers believed strength came from stability, from walls, from tradition, from hierarchy. The Mongols inverted that belief. They proved that flexibility could defeat permanence, that speed could defeat mass, that adaptation could defeat experience. This realization unsettled every civilization that came after them. Empires began redesigning themselves. Standing armies replaced feudal levies because response time mattered more than noble loyalty. Bureaucracies expanded so rulers could react faster to threats. Roads, messengers, and later telegraphs became strategic priorities. Communication, once a luxury, became a necessity of survival. These were not accidental developments. They were answers to a question the Mongols had forced the world to ask. How do you stop something that moves faster than you can think? Even diplomacy changed. After the Mongols, states learned to gather information before engaging. Treaties became tools, not ideals. Alliances became temporary. Trust became conditional. The world grew more cautious, more calculating. Innocence did not survive the step, but the Mongols did more than frighten rulers. They disrupted the way history itself was written. Before them, many societies believed their gods favored them uniquely. Their victories were signs of divine approval. Their cities were eternal because heaven willed it so. The Mongols shattered that belief. They defeated Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and pagans alike. No faith stopped them. No prayer saved cities. For many, this was spiritually devastating. If God protected civilization, why did civilization burn? Some turned inward, questioning belief. Others turned outward, becoming more rigid, more extreme. Faiths hardened. Dogma intensified. The Mongol invasions did not just redraw borders. They reshaped worldviews. They forced humanity to confront randomness, brutality, and the limits of divine protection. Yet even in destruction, synthesis occurred. Mongol courts became melting pots. Persian administrators served Mongol rulers. Chinese engineers built siege engines for steppe warriors. Arab astronomers advised Khans who had once destroyed their cities. Knowledge survived by adapting. Cultures blended, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded cooperation. This fusion quietly advanced human development. Cartography improved. Mathematics traveled farther. Medical knowledge spread across continents. The compass, paper, and printing techniques moved westward. Gunpowder followed. These exchanges accelerated global progress, even as the memory of violence lingered. The Mongols did not invent these technologies, but they moved them faster than any empire before. Speed was always their true weapon. And speed is addictive. Once the world experienced rapid connection, it could not return to isolation. Even after Mongol power faded, trade routes remained. Curiosity grew. Exploration followed. The desire to reach distant lands, to control trade, to dominate movement became central ambitions of future empires. In this sense, the Mongols were not an ending, they were a beginning. But beginnings come with shadows. The Mongols also normalized total war. Civilian populations were no longer sacred. Cities were legitimate targets. Psychological warfare became acceptable. These ideas did not disappear with the empire. They resurfaced repeatedly across history. In early modern wars, in colonial conquest, in industrial conflicts, the logic of annihilation had entered the global mindset. This is the uncomfortable inheritance. We like to believe modern brutality is an aberration, a failure of progress. But the Mongols remind us that violence has always been systematic when power demands it. They simply stripped away the illusion that war could remain civilized. Still, reducing the Mongols to brutality alone misses the deeper truth. They were not driven by madness. They were driven by logic shaped by survival. On the steppe, hesitation meant death. Mercy invited revenge. Strength was the only language universally understood. Genghis Khan did not romanticize violence. He weaponized it. And that distinction matters, because it means the Mongol Empire was not inevitable because of cruelty. It was inevitable because of clarity. Clarity about goals, about loyalty, about consequences. In a world tangled by tradition and ceremony, the Mongols were brutally straightforward. That simplicity made them unstoppable. But simplicity also limits longevity. As Mongol rulers settled, governed cities, and embraced luxury, their clarity blurred. Compromise replaced decisiveness. Politics replaced purpose. The empire that thrived on motion slowed, and history, relentless as ever, moved on. Yet, even as the Mongols faded, the questions they raised remained unanswered. Can power exist without brutality? Can order exist without fear? Can civilization defend itself against forces that refuse its rules? Every generation answers these questions differently. Every empire believes it has found a better balance, and every empire eventually faces its own reckoning. This is why the Mongol story refuses to rest. It is not just about the past. It is about cycles, about rise and collapse, about how quickly the world can change when someone understands it better than everyone else. Genghis Khan did not predict the future. He exposed the present. He revealed what happens when adaptability meets opportunity, when discipline meets chaos, when hunger meets weakness. The world was not prepared for him, and by the time it tried to be, it was too late. That truth still resonates, because history does not warn politely. It arrives suddenly, decisively, and often from directions we ignore. The Mongols came from the edges of the known world. They shattered its center, and then they vanished, leaving humanity forever altered. The question that lingers is not what they did. It is whether the world has truly learned from it. By the time the 13th century ended, the Mongol Empire had already done more to shape the modern world than most civilizations would achieve in centuries. Yet even as it fragmented into separate khanates, its influence persisted like an invisible current running beneath history's surface. It reshaped trade, warfare, culture, and even the very way rulers thought about power. The Golden Horde, stretching across Russia, became an incubator for lessons in control and taxation. Princes learned to govern efficiently while paying tribute, often using the Mongol system to consolidate authority. Moscow, in particular, absorbed these lessons, slowly rising to become a dominant regional power. The Mongols had left a blueprint for centralized control, even as their direct rule faded. Russia's eventual emergence as a European power owed much to these early experiences. In the Middle East, Mongol influence was paradoxical. Baghdad's destruction in 1258 was catastrophic, wiping out centuries of knowledge. Yet, later Mongol rulers who converted to Islam became patrons of art, science, and architecture. Persian culture adapted, blending Mongol administrative efficiency with local traditions. Cities rebuilt, sometimes stronger, sometimes smarter. In this way, devastation became a prelude to cultural evolution. China faced perhaps the most visible and lasting changes. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, brought Mongol rule into the heart of the Chinese Empire. Governance was centralized, trade expanded, roads, canals, and postal systems flourished. The Mongols encouraged foreign visitors and integration of knowledge from across their empire, yet resentment simmered among native Chinese, ultimately fueling the Ming uprising and a return to traditional rule. The Mongols had demonstrated the potential of cross-cultural administration, but also the limits of ruling without cultural sensitivity. Across these lands, the Mongol emphasis on meritocracy left a profound imprint. Skilled individuals rose through ability rather than birth. Generals, administrators, and artisans were recognized for competence. This principle challenged centuries of rigid social hierarchies and inspired future rulers to value skill over lineage. Even today, merit-based systems in governance, the military and commerce echo the Mongol precedent. Trade and connectivity were transformed permanently. The Silk Road, which the Mongols secured through their Pax Mongolica, facilitated unprecedented movement of goods, knowledge, and people. Spices, silk, and precious metals traveled thousands of miles, but so did ideas, scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and religious thought, crossed boundaries previously thought impenetrable. The Mongols accelerated globalization centuries before the term existed, yet along with these advances came consequences. Diseases spread along the same routes that trade traveled. The Black Death moved from Asia to Europe along Mongol trade networks, decimating populations and reshaping economies. Cities were abandoned. Labor became scarce. Social hierarchies shifted. In unintended ways, the Mongols had catalyzed demographic and economic transformations that continued long after their rule ended. Even European warfare changed. Armies learned that mobility, intelligence, and coordination could overcome numerical advantage or fortifications. Military treatises began referencing Mongol strategies. The psychological component of war, fear, deception, and morale became as critical as weapons. The Mongols had turned the art of war into a science of efficiency and adaptability. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the understanding that power could come from unexpected places. A boy abandoned on the steppe could rise to dominate the known world. A nomadic culture, previously dismissed as primitive, could conquer settled civilizations. These lessons haunted rulers, inspiring both caution and ambition. The edge of the map was no longer a limit. It was a place of potential. Even in modern times, the Mongol shadow persists. Military historians study their campaigns for insight into strategy and logistics. Economists examine their facilitation of trade. Political scientists analyze their methods of governance and control. The empire's DNA is embedded not only in genetics, but in systems, institutions, and ways of thinking that persist across continents. Genghis Khan's story, above all, reminds humanity of the fragile balance between chaos and order. The Mongols did not simply conquer land. They conquered systems. They rewrote rules, enforced loyalty, and demonstrated that a single determined mind could reshape civilizations. And although empires rose after them, none have matched the speed, scale, and shock of their expansion. But the Mongol lesson is not merely historical, it is philosophical. It asks uncomfortable questions. How secure is civilization? How permanent are our achievements? How much depends on adaptability, decisiveness, and willingness to break norms? The Mongols showed that survival favors the ruthless and the clever, and that complacency invites destruction. Their empire may have fragmented, but the impact of their decisions, methods, and vision persists. Borders drawn, cities rebuilt, armies reorganized, all were influenced, directly or indirectly, by the Mongols. Civilization, as we know it, carries the imprint of their conquest. And yet, the story leaves one final chilling realization: the world is always on the brink of transformation. Genghis Khan came from obscurity, and history's trajectory shifted because he understood the moment better than anyone else. Empires rise and fall, but the principles of power, adaptability, and strategy remain. History repeats, not in exact events, but in lessons, and those who ignore them are doomed to rediscover them the hard way. The Mongol Empire, at its height, was more than an aggregation of conquered territories. It was a living, breathing system that combined mobility, discipline, and ruthless efficiency. Each khanate, while distinct, adhered to principles Genghis Khan had instilled: loyalty, intelligence, speed, and an unflinching use of power. Even in death, he continued to command the direction of his empire, shaping events from beyond the grave through carefully chosen successors and trained generals who understood his vision. The Mongol machine was unmatched in human history, a network capable of striking fear and achieving unprecedented scale. But scale comes with fragility. While the empire expanded faster than any previous polity, the infrastructure necessary to maintain such control had limits. The Mongol emphasis on conquest over administration meant that governance relied heavily on personal loyalty to the Khan and strict military discipline. When the empire fractured into separate khanates, Golden Horde, Il Khanate, Chagatai Khanate, and Yuan dynasty, the very mechanisms that fueled expansion became sources of vulnerability. Regional ambitions, disputes over succession, and cultural differences slowly eroded unity. Still, each khanate retained the Mongol philosophy of war and governance, ensuring the empire's shadow extended long after central authority weakened. In Europe, the memory of Mongol power lingered like a constant warning. Cities' fortified walls, reorganized armies, and centralized governments in direct response to the terrifying efficiency of Mongol campaigns. The invasions of Hungary and Poland in the 1240s left an indelible psychological imprint. Even after the Mongols withdrew, European leaders internalized the lesson: mobility, intelligence, and ruthlessness could defeat armies twice their size. These insights influenced military evolution for centuries, preparing Europe for future conflicts in the early modern period. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the destruction wrought by Hulagu Khan on Baghdad had long-lasting consequences. The city had been a hub of science, philosophy, and art. Its obliteration sent ripples of cultural trauma across the Islamic world. Yet, paradoxically, the subsequent integration of Mongol rule into the region led to cultural synthesis. Mongol rulers adopted Islamic practices, employed Persian bureaucrats, and commissioned architecture that blended steppe and city influences. Knowledge survived, sometimes in new forms, proving that destruction could coexist with creation, that even brutality could generate long-term structural change. China, under Kublai Khan, demonstrated the full spectrum of Mongol governance. Kublai embraced Chinese administrative traditions while imposing the discipline and hierarchical order of his ancestors. The Yuan dynasty unified diverse peoples under one empire, introduced foreign travelers like Marco Polo, and encouraged international trade. Roads, canals, and relay stations connected distant corners of the empire, facilitating commerce and communication. Yet, resentment simmered among the Chinese population, and eventually the Ming dynasty expelled the Mongols, illustrating the difficulty of balancing conquest with cultural integration. Still, the lessons of governance, trade, and administration endured. The Mongols' greatest innovation may have been their understanding of information and intelligence. Scouts, spies, and messengers allowed commanders to anticipate enemy movements and respond with unprecedented speed. Genghis Khan recognized that knowledge could act as a force multiplier, transforming smaller armies into unstoppable forces. This principle, studied by generals throughout history, remains foundational in modern military and political strategy. The ability to gather, interpret, and act on intelligence often determines victory more than numbers alone. Trade and connectivity were forever altered. The Pax Mongolica, enforced through both fear and infrastructure, allowed merchants, artisans, and scholars to traverse Eurasia with relative safety. Ideas, technologies, and goods moved along the Silk Road at speeds unimaginable to previous generations. Innovations in printing, astronomy, engineering, and medicine spread far beyond their places of origin. Even the transmission of gunpowder technology from east to west was accelerated by Mongol trade treaties. The empire catalyzed a proto-globalization centuries before modern definitions existed. Yet the Mongol legacy was double-edged. The same networks that allowed cultural and technological diffusion also facilitated the spread of disease. The Black Death traveled along these routes, devastating populations in Asia and Europe alike. Trade and destruction became inseparable partners, a reminder that the empire's efficiency could have catastrophic unintended consequences. Civilization advanced, but at a price. Genghis Khan's most enduring lesson, however, was strategic vision. He proved that power derives not from wealth alone, nor from tradition, nor from divine favor, but from the ability to act decisively and relentlessly. The Mongol Empire grew because its leaders understood the terrain, the timing, and the psychology of their enemies. They exploited weaknesses without hesitation and rewarded loyalty while punishing failure. Success was systematized, not left to chance. This approach would influence countless empires that followed. Even as empires fell and borders shifted, the principles of the Mongols persisted: centralization of power, meritocracy, mobility, intelligence, and ruthless discipline became touchstones for rulers across continents. The Mongols reshaped the world, not only by conquest, but by demonstrating what was possible when vision, strategy, and adaptability met ambition. The empire's physical presence may have receded, but its influence is evident in every connected civilization, in every state that values intelligence, speed, and adaptability. Genghis Khan's shadow is not merely historical, it is structural, philosophical, and strategic. He transformed the way humanity thinks about power, war, governance, and survival. Ultimately, the story of the Mongols is a story of human potential unleashed under extraordinary circumstances. It forces an uncomfortable recognition. Empires are fragile, civilization is vulnerable, and the margins of society often produce the most decisive actors. The boy who survived betrayal, exile, and hunger became the architect of the largest contiguous empire in human history. And his legacy continues to challenge our assumptions about strength, strategy, and the forces that shape the world. Even as the Mongol Empire fragmented, its influence persisted across continents, reshaping human civilization in ways few empires have. Its most enduring legacy was not the cities it conquered or the armies it led, but the transformation of systems, military, administrative, and cultural, that became templates for the future. What made the Mongols extraordinary was their ability to enforce order in chaos, to make movement and speed central to power, and to wield fear as a strategic tool without succumbing to mindless brutality. Consider the military innovations that emerged. Mongol commanders like Subutai orchestrated campaigns that spanned thousands of kilometers, coordinating multiple armies simultaneously. Feigned retreats, rapid redeployments, and psychological warfare became standard. These tactics would influence European, Middle Eastern, and Asian warfare for centuries. Generals studied Mongol campaigns to understand the power of intelligence, mobility, and the careful orchestration of logistics. The Mongols turned war into a science, demonstrating that organization and planning could outweigh sheer numbers. Beyond the battlefield, their administrative systems were revolutionary. Genghis Khan introduced laws that applied to both Mongols and conquered peoples, emphasizing loyalty, merit, and efficiency. Taxes were collected consistently, trade was regulated, and communication networks. The Yam system allowed messages to travel thousands of kilometers in days. This integration of governance, mobility, and enforcement was unprecedented. Later empires, from the Ottomans to the Russians, adopted similar systems to consolidate control and maintain order across diverse populations. Trade networks flourished under Mongol oversight. The Silk Road became safer than ever, allowing goods, technologies, and ideas to move across Eurasia with relative security. Paper money, compass technology, printing techniques, and gunpowder were transmitted westward along these routes, reshaping civilizations far removed from the Mongols' heartland. The empire's enforced connectivity accelerated globalization centuries before the modern era, proving that commerce and conquest were mutually reinforcing. Yet, this expansion had unintended consequences. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried disease. The Black Death traveled along Mongol networks, decimating Europe and Asia alike. Entire regions faced demographic collapse. Societies that survived were forced to adapt, developing more resilient economic, social, and political structures. In this way, the Mongols indirectly reshaped the course of human history, for better and worse, long after their armies had receded. Culturally, the Mongols were both destructive and integrative. Cities like Baghdad and Nishapur suffered devastating destruction, yet Mongol rule also promoted exchange and synthesis. Administrators, artisans, and scholars from diverse cultures worked together under Mongol oversight. Persian bureaucrats advised Mongol Khans. Chinese engineers built siege engines for steppe warriors. The result was a hybridization of knowledge, practices, and ideas that accelerated innovation across Eurasia. Civilization, in many ways, advanced because it had to survive Mongol pressure. In the Islamic world, the duality was stark. While the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, Later rulers embraced Islam and patronized the arts, science, and infrastructure. Persian culture flourished under the Ilkhanate, blending Mongol pragmatism with local sophistication. In China, the Yuan dynasty introduced international trade and diplomatic networks, while simultaneously generating resentment among the local population. Across the Mongol-controlled world, the empire created both trauma and opportunity, destruction and growth, fear and integration. Meritocracy, a core Mongol principle, left a lasting mark. Skilled individuals could rise to positions of power based on talent rather than lineage. Commanders, administrators, and engineers were rewarded for ability. This contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchies of neighboring civilizations and influenced future governments, military structures, and social systems. The Mongols demonstrated that adaptability and competence often outweigh inheritance and tradition, a lesson that resonates to this day. The psychological impact of the Mongols cannot be overstated. Cities surrendered preemptively, armies dissolved at the mere rumor of their approach. Fear became a strategic weapon. Stories of massacre and destruction spread faster than soldiers ever could. Submissions were calculated, resistance was annihilated. This approach created a new paradigm of governance and warfare, where perception and morale mattered as much as actual force. Civilizations learned that survival required anticipation, adaptability, and humility in the face of a superior enemy. Even beyond direct rule, the Mongols shaped global history. European exploration, for instance, was motivated in part by the desire to access resources and knowledge that Mongol-controlled Asia had facilitated. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats learned that the world was interconnected and that borders could be bridged through networks, infrastructure, and diplomacy. The Mongols had demonstrated the benefits and dangers of globalization long before modern terminology existed. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of all was the lesson that extraordinary outcomes often emerge from the margins. Genghis Khan was a boy abandoned on the steppe, a man with no inheritance, no wealth, no status. Yet he harnessed intelligence, discipline, and opportunity to reshape the world. His empire forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths: that civilization is fragile, that power favors preparation and decisiveness, and that the margins of society often produce the most transformative figures. The Mongol Empire, though physically fragmented, left an imprint that cannot be erased. Its principles, mobility, intelligence, adaptability, meritocracy, and strategic use of fear, continued to inform military strategy, governance, trade, and global connectivity for centuries. Even today, the shadow of Genghis Khan looms in the systems we use, the borders we defend, and the lessons we study. In the end, the Mongols were not just conquerors, they were catalysts. They accelerated history, exposed vulnerabilities, and created systems that survived long after their empire faded. The story of Genghis Khan is therefore not only about conquest, but about human potential, how ambition, clarity, and relentless adaptation can reshape the world. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, was an unprecedented force in human history. Its rapid expansion across Eurasia was unmatched, but what truly set it apart was not only its size, it was its systemic genius. Genghis Khan understood the interplay of fear, loyalty, and efficiency. He knew that victory was not simply achieved by force, but by organizing people, information, and strategy into an unstoppable machine. Every campaign was meticulously planned, every conquest a combination of speed, intelligence, and psychological pressure. It was a level of organization that left contemporaries awestruck and terrified. Even after Genghis Khan's death, his successors carried forward his vision. Kublai Khan, for example, ruled China with both Mongol discipline and Chinese bureaucratic expertise. The Yuan dynasty introduced reforms in taxation, trade, and infrastructure, connecting vast regions under a single administration. Roads and canals facilitated movement of troops, goods and information, while messenger stations ensured orders could be communicated across thousands of miles. The empire functioned as a living network, where efficiency and control were paramount. Yet, despite its sophistication, the empire was also vulnerable, as internal divisions and cultural resistance threatened its cohesion. The Mongols' understanding of mobility transformed warfare. Unlike settled armies constrained by geography, Mongol forces moved swiftly, striking unpredictably. They could bypass fortified cities, surround enemies, and coordinate multi-pronged attacks with precision. These tactics not only overwhelmed foes, but also reshaped military thinking globally. European, Middle Eastern, and Asian armies adapted lessons from the Mongols, incorporating mobility, reconnaissance, and psychological operations into their doctrines. Genghis Khan's campaigns became timeless case studies in strategy, proving that intellectual rigor in war could surpass sheer numbers. Trade and connectivity were also revolutionized. The Mongols established a network of routes stretching from China to Europe, enabling commerce on an unprecedented scale. Merchants traveled safely under the protection of the empire, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Paper money, printing, compass navigation, and gunpowder moved across continents faster than ever before. The Silk Road, stabilized and secured by Mongol oversight, became the arteries of early globalization. In this way, the Mongols were catalysts not only of destruction, but of progress, inadvertently accelerating the diffusion of knowledge and culture. Yet the empire's efficiency also had unintended consequences. The same networks that allowed goods and ideas to flow freely also enabled the rapid spread of the Black Death. Entire regions were decimated, and social hierarchies were disrupted. Cities abandoned, economies collapsed, and populations fell dramatically. The Mongols had created a world more interconnected than ever before, but that interconnectedness carried risks as severe as the opportunities it provided. Civilization itself had become more fragile and exposed. Cultural integration was another hallmark of Mongol rule. Though they were conquerors, they often adopted local practices and incorporated regional expertise into their administration. Persian administrators advised Mongol Khans. Chinese engineers built infrastructure for the empire. Artisans and scholars moved between courts, blending traditions and technologies. Even as cities were destroyed, new forms of knowledge, art, and governance emerged. The Mongols were both destroyers and facilitators, a duality that left a lasting imprint on the civilizations they touched. Meritocracy, central to Mongol society, challenged centuries-old hierarchies. Leadership was earned through skill, not birth. Soldiers, administrators, and generals were promoted based on ability and loyalty. This principle empowered individuals from modest backgrounds and created a culture of efficiency and competence. Societies that observed and interacted with the Mongols were forced to reconsider the importance of talent versus lineage. This lesson resonated far beyond the steppe, influencing governance structures for generations. The psychological component of Mongol dominance cannot be overstated. Fear was deployed strategically. Cities surrendered in anticipation of the Mongols' arrival. Armies dissolved at rumors of their approach. Stories of massacres traveled faster than soldiers could, preemptively weakening resistance. Yet, this fear was not arbitrary. Submission was rewarded, resistance punished decisively. The Mongols demonstrated that perception, morale, and reputation could be as critical as actual force. a lesson that would echo in military theory for centuries. Even in areas where they did not rule directly, Mongol influence persisted. In Russia, the Golden Horde's presence reshaped political structures, encouraging centralization and strategic consolidation. In the Islamic world, Persian and Central Asian states incorporated Mongol administrative efficiency while preserving local culture. In Europe, knowledge of Mongol strategies influenced military organization and diplomatic practices. The empire's intellectual and cultural ripple effects were profound and enduring. Ultimately, the Mongol Empire teaches an uncomfortable truth. Power is dynamic, fragile, and often emerges from unexpected places. Genghis Khan rose from the margins, yet reshaped the entire world. His empire was a demonstration of what occurs when intelligence, discipline, and opportunity converge. Civilization, in contrast, is often slow to adapt, making it vulnerable to forces like the Mongols. And while empires rise and fall, the principles of mobility, adaptability, meritocracy, and strategic foresight endure. The Mongols were more than conquerors, they were architects of transformation. They forced humanity to confront the fragility of stability, the power of adaptability, and the unpredictable potential of individuals. The lessons of their empire continue to resonate, reminding us that history is never as secure as it seems, and that extraordinary change often comes from the least expected sources. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached a scale that seemed almost unimaginable. From the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Eastern Europe, from the deserts of Persia to the rivers of China, their influence stretched across continents. Yet, beneath the vastness of territory lay a far more significant innovation: the Mongol approach to human organization and strategy. Genghis Khan and his successors did not rely solely on fear or force. They relied on systems, networks, and disciplined execution. This was what made their empire both formidable and lasting in influence, even when political control waned. At the heart of Mongol power was mobility. Cavalry units could traverse vast distances in days, striking enemies before they had a chance to react. Scouts and intelligence networks provided real-time information about enemy positions and movements. They perfected the art of deception. Feigned retreats, ambushes, and synchronized attacks were all used to demoralize opponents before battles even began. European, Middle Eastern, and Asian armies studied these tactics for generations, understanding that speed, coordination, and surprise could outweigh numerical superiority. The Mongols transformed the very logic of warfare. Beyond military conquest, the Mongols reshaped governance. Administrative systems imposed order across diverse cultures and languages. The empire implemented standardized laws, taxation, and communication networks. The Yam courier system allowed rapid transmission of orders across thousands of kilometers, effectively creating a pre-modern equivalent of centralized administration. This combination of control and flexibility became a model for later empires, from the Ottoman Turks to the Tsars of Russia. The Mongols demonstrated that power is not simply about territory, it is about the ability to move, coordinate, and enforce efficiently. Trade flourished under the Pax Mongolica. Caravans traveled safely across the Silk Road, enabling unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Paper money, compass navigation, and gunpowder were transmitted across continents. Knowledge traveled faster, bringing astronomy, medicine, and engineering innovations to regions that had never encountered them before. The Mongols inadvertently laid the foundations of globalization, connecting societies in ways that would influence centuries of economic and cultural development. Yet, this global connectivity had a darker side. The same networks that enabled trade also facilitated the spread of disease. The Black Death, transmitted along Mongol routes, decimated populations from Asia to Europe, creating social, economic and political upheaval. Entire cities were abandoned, labor shortages shifted economic power, social hierarchies were challenged. In this, the Mongols' legacy was dual. They advanced civilization while simultaneously exposing it to unprecedented risks. Culturally, the Mongols were paradoxical. They destroyed as easily as they integrated. Baghdad's libraries were obliterated, yet Persian scholars were employed in Mongol courts. Chinese engineers served Mongol generals. Islamic art and architecture were influenced by steppe aesthetics. In a way, destruction and creation were inseparable in the Mongol approach. Survival demanded adaptation, and adaptation fostered innovation. The world after the Mongols was simultaneously scarred and enriched. Meritocracy was another defining feature. The Mongols valued skill over lineage. Leaders were chosen for ability and loyalty, not for aristocratic birth. Soldiers, administrators, and artisans rose on competence rather than pedigree. This challenged existing social hierarchies across Eurasia and influenced governance for centuries. Empires that interacted with the Mongols observed and sometimes adopted this principle, realizing that effectiveness often outweighs tradition. Fear remained a strategic tool. Cities surrendered before battles to avoid massacre. Rumors and stories amplified psychological pressure. The Mongols understood that perception could be as lethal as force. Morale, reputation, and psychological manipulation were as central to their campaigns as swords and arrows. This approach transformed not only how wars were fought, but also how states governed, negotiated, and defended themselves in a post-Mongol world. The empire's influence also catalyzed philosophical and political reflection. Genghis Khan demonstrated that extraordinary results could emerge from the margins of society. A boy abandoned on the steppe became the master of the largest contiguous empire in history. This challenged assumptions about power, legitimacy, and societal order. Civilization learned that opportunity, preparation, and decisiveness often determine historical outcomes more than tradition, wealth, or divine favor. Even centuries later, the Mongol blueprint continued to shape global structures. Military strategy, trade networks, governance systems, and meritocratic principles all trace lines back to their innovations. The empire may have physically fragmented, but its lessons endured, echoing in institutions, borders, and even modern geopolitical thought. Genghis Khan's empire was a proof of principle that adaptability, clarity of vision, and strategic use of resources could reshape the world. The story of the Mongols is, ultimately, a story of potential. It shows how human ambition, when combined with intelligence and ruthlessness, can alter the course of history. The world learned to fear them, to study them, and to build systems that anticipated their strategies. And while their banners no longer fly, the shadow of the Mongol Empire stretches across centuries, reminding humanity that the margins often hold the most transformative forces. The final chapter of the Mongol story is not one of decline, but of enduring influence. While the empire fragmented into separate khanates and eventually disappeared as a unified political entity, the structures, ideas, and transformations it introduced continued to ripple through history. Genghis Khan's vision of disciplined armies, meritocratic leadership, rapid communication, and strategic use of fear remained instructive for rulers, generals, and states for centuries. His empire was a lesson in how adaptability and decisiveness could rewrite the rules of civilization itself. In the Golden Horde, the Mongols influenced Russian governance profoundly. Princes learned to consolidate power, extract tribute efficiently, and maintain loyalty through a balance of coercion and reward. This framework allowed Moscow to grow into a dominant regional power, eventually laying the foundations for the Russian Empire. The Mongols' administrative efficiency became a template, even as their direct control faded. Their legacy was institutional, structural, and enduring. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate blended Mongol military organization with Persian culture and Islamic administration. Cities rebuilt, art flourished, and knowledge survived. Mongol rulers, who adopted Islam, fostered a fusion of traditions that enriched Persian civilization. Their approach illustrated the paradox of conquest, destruction, and creation, often go hand in hand. The Mongols had devastated the region, yet their governance enabled recovery, cultural synthesis, and innovation. China, too, experienced lasting transformation. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan centralized administration, encouraged trade, and connected distant regions through infrastructure. Roads, canals, and communication networks created efficiency and cohesion on a scale unprecedented in Chinese history. Even after the Ming expelled the Mongols, the lessons of connectivity, governance, and strategic mobility remained embedded in Chinese administration. The Mongols had shown that integration, discipline, and innovation could govern even the most diverse populations. Trade and connectivity, perhaps the most tangible legacy, persisted far beyond Mongol rule. The Silk Road, stabilized by Mongol authority, enabled the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. Paper, gunpowder, printing, and navigational tools traveled westward, accelerating development in Europe and beyond. The Mongols, through both intention and circumstance, had created an early form of globalization. The world became smaller, faster, and more interconnected because of their empire, yet their influence was double-edged. The same networks that facilitated commerce also spread the Black Death, reshaping demographics and economies. Entire regions were depopulated. Labor shortages shifted social and economic power, and urban hierarchies were forever altered. Mongol efficiency accelerated both progress and catastrophe. History was reshaped, demonstrating that every advantage carries hidden costs. Meritocracy remained a defining feature of Mongol governance. Leadership and opportunity were tied to skill and loyalty, rather than birthright. This challenged rigid hierarchies across Eurasia, creating opportunities for talented individuals regardless of origin. Generals, administrators, and scholars rose through competence. The principle influenced subsequent empires, highlighting the enduring value of ability over inheritance in governance and military command. The psychological legacy of the Mongols also endured. Fear, perception, and reputation became recognized as strategic tools. Civilizations learned that morale and anticipation could determine outcomes as much as armies and fortifications. This understanding influenced diplomacy, warfare, and governance for centuries, emphasizing that effective power is as much about intellect and perception as it is about brute force. More broadly, the Mongol Empire reshaped the way humanity views potential. Genghis Khan's rise from obscurity on the harsh steppes to the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history illustrates a timeless truth. Transformative change often comes from unexpected quarters. Preparation, vision, and decisive action can overcome tradition, wealth, and entrenched hierarchies. History itself is shaped not only by institutions, but by individuals who understand the moment better than anyone else. The final lesson of the Mongols is both inspiring and unsettling. Civilizations are fragile. Power favors clarity, adaptability, and decisiveness, and the margins of society often hold the most transformative forces. The Mongols forced humanity to confront these truths in the harshest possible ways, leaving a legacy that extends far beyond conquest and destruction. Today, the influence of the Mongols is everywhere, in military strategy, governance, trade networks, and cultural exchange. Genghis Khan's empire may have dissolved, but the principles it embodied continue to shape the world. Speed, intelligence, meritocracy, psychological strategy, and adaptability remain timeless lessons for any society seeking to survive and thrive. The story of the Mongols is not merely about conquest, it is about transformation. It is about the power of vision, the necessity of adaptability, and the enduring impact of those who rise from obscurity to shape history. Their empire may have fallen, but their shadow endures, a reminder that extraordinary change often comes from the least expected places, and that the lessons of the past continue to resonate in the present. If this journey through the rise and legacy of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire amazed you, don't let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to uncover more of history's greatest conquerors, forgotten empires, and shocking tales that shaped the world. Share this video with friends who love history and dive into the past like never before, because the lessons of history are the keys to understanding our future. Don't just watch history, experience it. Click subscribe and join us on the journey.